Have you ever gone for a job interview and had a one-way interview and wondered if you should have accommodations for that as an autistic person? If you haven't had one of those one-way interviews ever, I'm going to demystify a little bit what one is like that I went through today for a position that is with an employer that I worked for in the past. And they're a fantastic employer. This is not a review of them at all, but pretty much what this one was set up like was a little confusing to me because the email I got before I started it said that it could be a combination of answering questions via video, an essay, or multiple choice questions. And I chose not to ask for accommodations because I'm a late diagnosed autistic person and I've always been able to get jobs, to maintain jobs without having accommodations. So I didn't really think that it would be something I would need, but I don't have a ton of experience with one-way interviews. I had gone through this particular vendor before with one other job that I applied for several months ago. And so I knew a little bit of what to expect if the questions were video questions, but I really didn't know if I was going to regret my decision not to ask for accommodations. So let's get into kind of the weeds for just a moment. So what this platform was like without accommodations. I don't know what it would have been like with accommodations. I can't speak to that. I would hope that the time element I'm about to discuss would be done away with or somehow accommodated for. But basically, there was a practice question that I could do in advance, and it was over video. And it did tell me once I actually accepted the terms of use that this particular one-way interview was going to be all video. So I found out within a minute or two of starting it that I was not going to have to write an essay and that I was not going to have to do some multiple choice questions. I thought perhaps the multiple choice questions would be a personality test type of thing, which for autistic folks can definitely be problematic. But I knew after, clicking accept that it would be all video. They did allow me to do a practice question. I was able to watch it back, but it really rattled me in a way that made me wish I had asked for accommodations, at least at that point, because the parameters were you got 60 seconds to prepare, and the question was on the screen. And then the instructions were that the respondent would have up to 3 minutes in order to answer the question. And if you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I'm a pretty wordy person. So I took almost 3 minutes to answer the practice question. When it was time to play it back, however, only the last 45 seconds of it were in playable view for me to review. And that really startled me because I thought, well, was my recording equipment not working? Is this just so that I'm not taking too much time reviewing stuff? Is it a technology issue? I really didn't know. So I'm like, well, if I take 3 minutes to answer the real questions, what's going to happen? So after that part was over, and I only had a couple of minutes to really review that after I had finished it. And then it went to the real questions. And they were very basic questions. I don't know that I'm allowed to say what the questions are for this job, but they're very standard interview questions. There were no curveballs. However, the really interesting thing about this was that it was for a job I didn't apply for. I applied for a particular job, and this interview was for a different job. And I wasn't sure going in. I thought I knew because the email said the title of the job that I would be interviewing for, and I happened to know the recruiter. So I reached out to ask a clarifying question, and she responded. So I'm not saying anything about her. I knew the information I knew from her, but I still wasn't totally sure until I hit record which job it was going to be for. And the first two questions were really generic. So that wasn't an issue. Even if I'm still under consideration for the job I actually applied for, the answers wouldn't have been different. The third question, however, was specific to the job I did not apply for. And that rattled me a little bit because I've never done work that it was asking me about. So we'll see how it shakes out. But the structure of it was like the practice question, in that I had a minute, so 60 seconds, to read the question and gather my thoughts or take any notes about what I wanted to say. And then I could either click the record button at any point in that 60 seconds and start answering, or it would start recording me after the 60 seconds, whether I had clicked record or not. That was also a little rattling, only because the last question I really, again, had to gather my thoughts because it was for work I had never done before. The other thing is that, again, the answers were limited to 3 minutes. And in the course of a face-to-face interview, rambling beyond 3 minutes generally isn't advised anyway, because the interviewers want to know that you can interview back and forth, answer questions, ask questions, not go off on tangents, all that kind of stuff that I know I do as an autistic person. And I'm generally good in in-person interviews because I can read the body language more or less when I need to. But knowing that I was capped at 3 minutes and seeing the timer counting down to closer and closer to zero with every second was a little nerve-wracking, because I kept saying, okay, am I getting to the point fast enough? Am I going off on tangents? Because I do. In real life, this is what I do. So I thought I would demystify that a little bit today with this video. They asked me they did a survey at the end, and I completed it. I very, very seldomly do surveys in real life outside of a job application type of thing like today. And I don't do them because unless the service is really, really bad or really, really good, I'm of the opinion that people get penalized on their job performance when some of the questions, typically people will answer them not with an individual in mind or even the product in mind, but there will be some other aspect that is involved in that customer's head, and it creates projects for people on the back end when the customer feedback is received. And I've worked in customer service almost my whole life in one capacity or another, but I did complete this one, and it was from the vendor. So it was mostly about the experience, but there was one question about, would I recommend someone apply to this employer based on this experience you've just had? And I answered yes. And then in the box, when it asked me to explain, I said, well, I'm an alumnus of this organization. It's a great company to work for. So, I'm going to suggest that people apply because that's been my experience. And I didn't talk about the product that vendor had supplied to the company for this one-way interview. So my thoughts on this were, if a person struggles under time constraints to come up with answers, If you're okay with asking for accommodations, it might be worth your while to do for a one-way interview, because it's one thing to be face to face and start to answer and then reading the body language of the people involved. It's a totally different thing to not have that and have that clock counting down. That made me more nervous than anything else in the interview, was seeing how much time and how close I was getting to zero. And 3 minutes really isn't that long, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that constraint being in an interview question, but I would rather have not seen the counter. They did have the option. There was a button I could press if I didn't want to see my own image while doing the interview. And I think that was really positive. I think a lot of people in general don't want to see their own picture when they're doing any kind of meeting or anything video conferencing. So I think a lot of people would probably like that option. Because of the YouTube stuff, I like seeing my picture. I like seeing how I'm framed within, the camera view. And it gave me an opportunity to play around with my lighting just to make sure, because I did have that short amount of time in between the practice and when the actual questions were asked, that I could make some adjustments with those things. I used a headset. I was not using the mic I used for this because I thought it would feel a little bit too much like YouTube, and my tone might shift just a little bit, and I'd maybe get a little too comfortable like I do in some of my videos. So it might be worth asking for accommodations. But if you typically are somebody that's okay without using accommodations, I do think that there may be some drawbacks of asking for accommodations with any employer, because there is unconscious bias that happens. And I don't know how the communication goes between the vendor and the company using their services for the interview. If they end up finding out if you asked for accommodations, I don't know. My guess is that they probably do, because if you needed accommodations for that, you may need accommodations for any subsequent interviews. The last point I want to make on this video before I wrap it up is, even though I'm employed right now, and I've talked before about how I'm doing a contract job, and it's a good job, I'm not necessarily looking to leave it. I interviewed and applied for this because it is with that former employer that I thought was a good employer. So I wanted to see, what the opportunity was all about. But if you haven't gone to any interviews lately, it might be worth your while to apply for a few jobs and do some practice interviews just to keep your skills up to date. I think that advice is good for anybody, neurotypical or neurodiverse. And it also is a way to see, okay, out of X number of applications, these are the number of interviews I do or don't get. Because that can inform, if you are employed and you have a rough patch with your current employer, it can inform how easy or difficult the job market is. And so if you're having a rough patch and you're tempted to quit, but then you find out you applied for a whole bunch of jobs and you can't get any interviews because the job market is tight, it can inform a person maybe not quitting or giving more thought into ways to work with the current employer to stay on. In my opinion, I think this is a tight job market. I think that for anybody that wants to work remote or even hybrid, it's especially difficult to land an interview because everybody's competing for those same jobs. So it isn't a bad idea to keep those interview skills fresh. And as I've mentioned before, I was laid off from a job, and it took me a long time to find a job because the job market is so tight, because it is so competitive, and because a lot of mass layoffs that are happening at large organizations throughout the United States right now. And I think probably in, multinational companies as well, overseas. There is a glut of people on the market who have comparable experience and education that might not have been the case, even a couple of years ago. So keep that in mind. And if you have any comments about what the job market is like now, comments about your opinion on one-way interviews, anything like that, feel free to put them in the comments section. I think we can help each other. And I appreciate you watching. Like and subscribe if you'd like more content. And take care.